One of the most disturbing royal secrets which exists in history is the fact that many of the kings and queens of England and Britain have in the centuries following their deaths had their coffins opened and their tombs opened. Sometimes incredible things are discovered. For example, King Edward I's remains were found remarkably preserved after around 500 years after his death, but the damage that these investigations caused often leads to instant decomposition of the body. There were the remains of Henry IV, who were disturbed 400 years after his death, and upon exposing the king's lower face to the air, it was said that his nose instantly shriveled, as it had for centuries been protected by a cerecloth, a heavy wax shroud. Queen Elizabeth I had her burial vault broken into, and Henry VIII's coffin may still today be opened and exposed to the air inside of the burial vault inside of St. George's Chapel, as his damaged coffin was never repaired. But there, shockingly, is one medieval king who, despite having his tomb in Westminster Abbey, a place where most of the tombs have been opened and where most of the burial vaults have been peered inside of, has never had his tomb disturbed over 600 years following his death. Edward III reigned for 50 years, and he oversaw some harrowing events such as the Black Death that caused suffering. But why has his tomb never been disturbed? And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Now, King Edward III was born on the 13th of November 1312, and it's presumed that as the son of King Edward II and Isabella of France, that he had a relatively successful education at a young age inside of the royal nursery. He became the king in 1327, as his father was deposed by his mother and her new lover, a man named Roger Mortimer. The following year, Edward III was then married to Philippa of Hainaut, and they had 13 children together. Edward's mother, Isabella, and Roger Mortimer ruled until 1330. But Edward III ruthlessly then had Mortimer executed, and he banished his mother from his kingdom. Much of Edward III's reign was dominated by wars with France, and there were ongoing territorial disputes between England and France, which were getting worse. Edward III also assumed the title of the King of France, and he ushered in a conflict known as the 100 Years' War, in which for over a century England and France would be in a state of fighting for different territories. There were brief periods of peace, but the English, to begin with, had a number of successes in France. Much of the fighting was led by Edward's eldest son, known as the Black Prince, and he even managed to capture John II, the French king, who was actually brought across to England and was held inside the Tower of London, whilst a ransom was agreed between the French and the English. Edward also held the Scottish king prisoner during his reign too, showing he was a skilled and respected military leader. He would also, throughout his reign, create the Order of the Garter, but his kingdom was at the time ravaged by the Black Death that caused chaos and huge amounts of death across England. Some believed that he was capable of healing, instigating the royal touch, but he was a medieval king whose main interest was warfare. The English later had mixed fortunes in the 100 Years' War and lost territory that they had gained, but in 1369 Edward's queen Philippa died, and he then became influenced by his mistress Alice Perez. She was seen as a corrupting force, and then following military failings and the further plague outbreaks, the Good Parliament was summoned of 1376. These attacked members of the court, and the king's mistress, and Edward III was forced to accept new councillors. Now, as he got older, he had a limited role in the running of his realm and country, and in the September of 1375 he fell ill with a large abscess. Despite recovering, the king had a stroke and died on the 21st of June 1377. He was succeeded by his 10-year-old grandson, King Richard II. But he had a huge funeral, which took place on the 5th of July, and he was buried near to the monument and tomb of his wife in the chapel of St Edward the Confessor, inside of Westminster Abbey. A full-length wooden lifelike effigy of Edward III was carried at his funeral, and this today has still survived, and it's believed that this effigy was carved from a death mask of Edward III immediately following his death. Now he was buried inside of a large and ornate tomb around the shrine of Edward the Confessor. His Purbeck marble tomb carries a gilt bronze effigy of Edward with long hair and a beard, and this tomb was constructed around 10 years after his death. On the effigy he wears coronation robes and holds the handle of sceptres, with this having been broken off. There are gilt angels around the tomb too, but the pillow that the effigy's head rests on was replaced, and there was a lion at his feet, which was also stolen and taken. The inscription around the coffin states, "Here is the glory of the English, the paragon of past kings, the model of future kings, a merciful king, the peace of the peoples, Edward III fulfilling the jubilee of his reign, the unconquered leopard, powerful in war, like a Maccabi. While he lives prosperously, his realm lived again in honesty. He ruled mighty in arms. Now in heaven, let him be a king." There were also 12 children in the form of bronze statues around the tomb, but only 6 of these remain, the other 6 having been taken or gone missing. Further decorations include shields, and a state sword which measures 7 feet long was kept near to his tomb for centuries, and this was long associated at Edward III's sword, and also a shield covered with canvas and black leather was kept by his tomb. These are today viewed inside an exhibition within Westminster Abbey. Now it is believed that inside of the tomb of Edward III are the bones and the corpse of the king, these being held in the tomb itself and the monument that can be seen. He is not interred inside of a burial vault, unlike many kings and queens inside of Westminster Abbey. However, what is surprising is that the tomb of King Edward III has never been opened, and that his remains have never been disturbed. It's not known specifically why this has never happened. Possibly there has never been a need to open the coffin to confirm that his remains are indeed inside, or that no story has needed clearing up centuries later. For example, the former Dean of Westminster Abbey, Arthur Stanley, went on a search for the remains of King James I, and he searched in many royal tombs and vaults for this, but never looked inside of Edward III's. This leads to a very high possibility that over 600 years following his death, the remains of the medieval king could be perfectly preserved to this day. His body, following death, would have been embalmed, his vital organs removed and placed in vessels elsewhere, and then his body would have been wrapped in a thick wax cloth known as a cerecloth. This aimed to protect and preserve the body and to keep away decay. Now it was known that because of this treatment that earlier kings, such as Edward I, had perfectly preserved remains. Edward III's body is likely perfectly preserved too, due to the lack of disturbing of the remains and the fact no one has peered inside. There could have been some problems if his remains were moved into the tomb after it was created, but there are also no records stating that the king's remains were tampered with in any way during the interring process. All of this means that Edward III is possibly one of the only medieval kings of England to have not had his remains disturbed or his coffin and tomb opened over the centuries by curious treasure hunters or people trying to find out something. As a king, his reputation has been questioned significantly over the years, but today he is considered a successful warrior king who, despite losing territory he once gained in France, established things such as the Order of the Garter, and his 50-year reign is one of the longest in English history. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.